Hello and welcome to the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. I'm Mark Rees, and on each episode, I investigate a different, weird, and wonderful subject. And on this episode, we are going to explore a supposedly haunted castle that is full of contradictions. It is, on the one hand, fantastically haunted. On the other, fantastically unhaunted. It is one of the most visited castles in Wales, but on the other hand, one of the most unvisited castles in Wales. And it is also a castle that is fantastically easy to conduct a paranormal investigation in, but on the other hand, it's fantastically difficult to conduct a paranormal investigation in this castle. And if that wasn't enough, we've even got some impressive Gothic literary links, or certainly romantic literary links. And there'll be an appearance from an old favourite on this podcast, Dylan Thomas. Good old Dylan Thomas makes a cameo on this episode. And a nearby building has a very tragic connection to romantic royalty. And I won't spoil all of the surprises here in the introduction, but if I say the word Frankenstein, you might have a pretty good idea of the family I'm talking about. And so, to begin at the beginning. And this episode concerns Swansea Castle. Swansea Castle, and I should get my shameless advert out of the way nice and quickly as well, because the reason I've chosen Swansea Castle for this episode is because I have a new book coming out in August, and this castle features in that book, which is called Paranormal Swansea and Gower, which you can pre-order now from all good bookshops, blah blah blah, and I'll talk a bit more about that book at the end of this episode. But Swansea Castle is one of the places that features in the book, and this episode is a chance for me to let you in on some spooky secrets, some confidential anecdotes and facts from my personal investigations into these locations. Because when I write these books, and I've written a few now, I am restricted by word counts. My publishers give me a maximum word count, and I can push my luck a little bit. They are quite lenient in fairness. They are lovely people, but I can only waffle on for so long in print, whereas with this podcast, I can waffle on for as long as I want. There are no editors telling me what I can and can't do. Maybe there should be. Maybe it would be a better podcast if they did. But what the heck? There's nobody to stop me, nobody to edit me, and that is why this episode is going to be a secret behind-the-scenes look, a special episode to tell you a little bit more about these supposed hauntings to complement what makes it onto the printed page. But anyway, that's enough build-up, that's enough waffle. If I had an editor, the last 2 minutes, I'm sure, would have been cut out. Let's get on with the important stuff, and let's take a look at Swansea Castle. And there were dozens of places in this book I could have chosen for this episode, and I've got a particularly nice one coming up on the next episode, but the reason I chose Swansea Castle for this episode is for lots of reasons, really. Firstly, because I was able to blag my way inside for a look around. And anyone who is familiar with Swansea Castle will know it's not the kind of place anyone can just go wandering around in, and I'll talk a little bit about that soon. Secondly, because it's somewhere that anyone can go and explore for free. Like I said, a place full of contradictions. But as regular listeners will know, I'm very passionate about finding locations and places that people with an interest in the paranormal can go and explore for free. For nothing, or for next to nothing. Maybe it'll cost you a bit of money in petrol or a bus ticket or whatever it might be. But effectively, it's free. You're not going to have to waste your life savings on some ridiculous equipment or some guided tour walking around in the dark for no good reason. And Swansea Castle is a great example of somewhere that, if you are in the area, you can pop along and have a look at for nothing in your own time. But I think the main reason I've chosen Swansea Castle is that if I had to pick one place of all of the places in the book that really does symbolise Swansea, it is Swansea Castle, because it is one of the most visited landmarks in the city, in the county of Swansea, even if most people don't realise they're actually visiting it. Because if you go to Swansea for any reason at all. If you go shopping in the daytime, if you go drinking in the nighttime, if you work in the city, if you're heading off to the stadium, whatever you're doing, if you've never been there before, if you're a diehard Jack, whatever you're doing in Swansea, there is a very good chance you will walk past or drive past that castle at some point because it's there, bang in the middle of the city centre. It's one of those unavoidable places that most people visiting Swansea will walk past whether they want to or not. You can't avoid it. From a city planning point of view, it's perfect. I am sure there are a lot of cities in the world that would love to have a castle in the middle of their town. Although I should say, I mentioned city planning. This wasn't, of course, planned. Swansea ended up with this castle in the middle of the town totally by accident. Well, not an accident. Let's look into the history of the castle, because that leads us nicely into the ghost stories. Because when it was first built, that location was chosen for practical reasons, purely for strategic reasons. They were not thinking ahead for commercial purposes. They weren't thinking in years to come, this will be easy access for ghost hunters. And Swansea, and I should make clear, when I use the word Swansea on this episode, I am talking about the county of Swansea as opposed to just the city. So the county of Swansea, which of course also includes Gower and places like Mumbles and so on. But the county of Swansea has a ridiculous amount of castles in it. I can't find the exact figure at hand at the moment, but I remember writing a story about hundreds of castles scattered about the place. Now, it might sound like a lot of castles. I mean, Wales in general is said to have the most castles per square mile than anywhere else, but most of these castles are not the impressive castles that you see in Game of Thrones. These castles now are little more than mounds in places, maybe a piece of rubble. But there are a handful of really impressive castles standing. Some of them have appeared on this podcast before. Oystermouth Castle is an old favourite and somewhere I've spent many a spooky night. Another one not far from that is Pennard Castle, and I have a fantastic new story about Pennard Castle in the book, and which I am sure I will talk about on this podcast at some point. And while these castles might look very picturesque today, very sublime on these wide rolling Gower landscapes or perched up on a hill in Mumbles, it's worth remembering they were not designed, these castles were not created for any aesthetic reasons. I mean, they didn't want ugly castles, of course, but they were created primarily for control, to subjugate the native Welsh people in many cases. And as such, castles are places that have seen a heck of a lot of history over the centuries, and not necessarily nice history. These are not always pleasant places, and that is why when it comes to ghostly activity, castles really are right up there as a popular place to encounter a ghost, because they are the scene of much death and destruction and war and pain and agony, and this seems to seep into the very stones, into the soil on which it stands, and maybe that explains why so many hauntings, so many ghost sightings are attached to these sites. And when it comes to Swansea Castle specifically, as I've mentioned, a lot of the castles in the area in Wales are not complete castles, far from it. Swansea Castle is somewhere in between. It is the ruins of a castle. It is nowhere near a full castle. But at the same time, there is a big wall and a big turret there that is looming over the city below. And if you get a chance, I would recommend having a quick internet search to have a look at a photo of Swansea Castle, which will do a much better job of visualizing it for you than I am right now. But this castle, as we see it today, is built in stone. It was built in stone in the 13th and the 14th centuries. It stands on the site of an even older timber building from the 12th century. So historically, there has been something on this site since the 12th century, and that location was chosen specifically because it is very close to the River Towy. It used to be even closer, but very close to the River Towy, or Avon Towy in Welsh, which incidentally is where Swansea gets its Welsh name from. Swansea in Welsh is Abertawe, Aber, mouth or estuary. Towy is the name of the river, and as I've randomly drifted off into talking about Welsh place names, you might have noticed Abertawe there is not a direct translation of Swansea. The words swan and sea are totally different to mouth or estuary and Towy. Towie. And if you're wondering where the English name Swansea came from, it has nothing to do with swans and it has nothing to do with the sea. Well, I guess it does have something to do with the sea because we can thank the Vikings. Not the English, not the Welsh, the Vikings. Because Swansea is derived from Swain's Eye, which means Swain's Island, with Swain in this case being King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark. Although, just to cover myself, I should put a little asterisk at the end of that explanation because it hasn't been proven conclusively. It's just a very, very strong theory and I really hope it's true. But anyway, that's why the location was chosen back in the day on the river. And according to folklore, like everything else on this podcast, according to folklore, this castle in Swansea is connected to Oystermouth Castle in Mumbles, the home of Swansea's most famous ghost, the White Lady of Mumbles, via an underground tunnel. This tunnel that went under the water and connected Swansea Castle with Oystermouth Castle, the home of the White Lady. And incidentally, I'm going to spoil this slightly already, but one of the ghosts said to be haunting Swansea Castle is a blue lady. Now, the idea that there's a tunnel connecting the two together, one of which is haunted by a white lady, the other is haunted by a blue lady. Maybe, just maybe, I'm thinking aloud here, maybe this is the same ghost just popping back and forth between each castle and changing her clothes along the way. I don't know if that's something they might do, just putting it out there. Now, talking about this blue lady, and I've done a lot of research into the White Lady of Oystermouth Castle, and you can trace her origins back to at least the Victorian age, when a full account was given of how she came to be haunting this castle. It was published in a book of Welsh tales, and the story was presumably based on an existing tale that is even older again. So the White Lady in Oystermouth Castle, this other castle down the road in Swansea, we can say for certain was being spoken about in the Victorian age, was almost certainly being spoken about before that, and afterwards many ghost hunters and folklorists have written about this ghost and have spoken about the ghost, including one of my favourite ghost hunters of all, good old Peter Underwood, who visited Swansea in the 1970s. But while Peter Underwood wrote about the White Lady in Oystermouth Castle, he wrote absolutely nothing about a blue lady in Swansea Castle. And he wasn't alone. In fact, as far as I can tell, and I'll hold my hands up now in advance and say, yes, I might have missed something, but I've got stacks and stacks and stacks of dusty old books in my office, and as far as I can tell, there is absolutely no mention of a blue lady anywhere in relation to Swansea Castle until the late 20th, early 21st century. So certainly within my lifetime, that is how recent these reports of the blue lady seem to be. And when they did emerge, they weren't in these dusty old books written by experts like Peter Underwood. Rather, they appeared in tourist literature, tourist material. And I know I can be a little bit skeptic at times, and I don't want to be too overly skeptical here, but this suggests to me that the blue lady just might have been a later invention used to attract attention to the castle. I've got no evidence for that. I just think it's a bit suspicious that this ghost just appeared from out of nowhere. And yes, I appreciate all ghosts appear from out of nowhere. They don't usually tell you in advance when they're going to pop up. Although maybe if I was going to make a joke out of it, maybe I should have said she appeared from out of the blue. But I think it's suspicious that there is no record of this figure whatsoever for centuries and centuries and centuries. And when it is finally mentioned, it is in material that is created specifically for commercial reasons, to increase footfall. It is created specifically to attract you to a location. Of course, on the other hand, this isn't to discount anyone's experiences, and I know there are people who do think they've seen this figure, a figure that's been described as a blue lady. The problem is when stories like this, which may or may not be true to start with, are put out into the public domain. When people do see something out of the ordinary, they might assume, I saw something strange, therefore it was the Blue Lady, rather than simply saying, I saw a shadowy figure that might not necessarily have been blue or even ladylike. All I'm saying is, from a research point of view, from a historical point of view, there is nothing in the records that I can find that can corroborate it. So, like I said at the start, this place is very haunted and very unhaunted. We have accounts from a number of people who certainly seem to think there is something going on in the castle. Where it gets tricky is that it may not necessarily have anything to do with a lady in blue. Now, if we fast forward through the centuries, the area directly outside the castle, which is an area you can walk on now, and there are grassy patches, you can sit down, walk along the path, which is a great way to have a close-up look at the ruins. But this area has played an important role in Swansea life over the years, which may or may not explain some of the spooky goings-on in this area, because this patch of land was a market, a town hall, maybe most importantly from a ghostly perspective, a prison. And again, prisons are right up there with pubs and castles as extra spooky places. As anyone who watches any paranormal TV shows will know, there's nothing ghosts like more than the sight of a prison. And in this case, they've got both. They've got the prison and they've got the castle together. What more could a spirit want? And it was also the local newspaper office for a while, where a budding young writer called Dylan Thomas, who did not go gentle into that good night, was given his first write-in job. And I won't dwell on Dylan too much right now. I mean, it's nice to position him in this sequence of events. But I did dedicate an entire episode to Dylan a few years ago now, back in the early days when I had no idea what I was doing. But if you are a Dylan Thomas fan and a Ghost fan, please go back and check that one out afterwards. But Dylan does play an important role in Swansea ghost lore, certainly in my book, because his spirit, in a, some might say, a literal sense, certainly a metaphorical sense, Dylan's spirit continues to haunt Swansea today. You don't need to walk far to find a statue inspired by Dylan, artwork inspired by Dylan, buildings named after Dylan. The many, many pubs he used to frequent, some of them are still open today, some of them might have changed names and things, but certainly the buildings are there where Dylan would pop in for a drink, and those who believe in such things believe his spirit continues to pop in for a quick shandy to this day. And even directly outside the castle itself, so directly opposite the newspaper office where Dylan was first paid a regular wage for writing words, there is a sculpture of a giant leaf. I think it's called the leaf boat, but a giant leaf in a fountain, which is quite a striking centerpiece in Swansea, directly outside the castle, which is inspired by the words of Dylan Thomas. Like I said, Dylan Thomas is everywhere in the city of Swansea and outside of the city. Down Gower, for example, I know there's a spot, and this is mentioned in the book, but there's a spot Dylan would take people to scare them with ghost stories. Now, I don't know the specifics about whether he believed in them or not, but he certainly used them to try and scare people. And another great location, and I won't go into too much detail again because I covered this on the Dylan Thomas episode, but in the uplands area of Swansea, where Dylan was born in Cumdonkin Drive, there's a nearby park with a lovely story attached to it, and the witness was somebody who had met Dylan in person, and they claimed that maybe, just maybe, Cumdonkin Park was haunted by the man himself. And the man who recorded that story was a ghost hunter called Peter Underwood. We're back to Peter Underwood, and if you believe in synchronicity, it's all coming together on this episode. It might sound like I'm making this up as I go along, and in fairness, I usually am making it up as I go along, but sometimes, just sometimes, it has been meticulously planned out. There is method in my madness, and all of these seemingly random elements are all coming together in the story of Swansea Castle. Whether it's ladies in blue or ladies in white or prisons or town halls or Peter Underwood and Dylan Thomas and the local newspaper, which Incidentally, and here's another random link to the story, but talking about the local newspaper, that is also where my own write-in career began. That's where I started as a journalist, and it's also where I published my first spooky articles. And this is one of the few things, well, probably the only thing that I share in common with Dylan Thomas, because we both started our write-in careers working for the same newspaper in Swansea. Although back in Dylan's day, the newspaper office was still based outside the castle, which of course is why I'm talking about it on this episode. By the time I joined, it had moved down the road to Adelaide Street, into this very 1960s looking tower block, which incidentally also has its own ghost stories. And if you'll indulge me in a quick tangent, and what the heck, this episode has been one tangent after another, so let's have one more. I'm sure it will all come together in the end again. Synchronicity. But this block, this tower block that the newspaper moved into, it's the kind of, not the most attractive of buildings, and it's the kind of building that a lot of British towns and cities ended up building, or rebuilding, you could say, after being targeted by the Nazis during the Second World War, and Swansea in particular was seen as an important port, and during what they called the Three Nights Blitz, so much of the city was just wiped out. It was flattened. All of the nice buildings were just gone in days. And as we were talking about Dylan Thomas, he did write this wonderful piece for radio called Return Journey, where he talks about how he was in London during this time, but he came back and saw the devastation that had happened to his hometown and wrote about it. But I think we've had enough Dylan for one episode, but if you get a chance, check out Dylan's Return Journey. But as a result of this bombing, this newspaper building emerged from the wreckage in the 1960s, and the newspaper stayed there for 45 years and did pick up a few ghost stories over the years. Now, in particular, the security guards were always good value for these ghost stories because they were the ones who were there at all times, day and night, 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning when even the printing presses had stopped. Those security guards were still there in a massive building by themselves, and as you'd imagine, they did have some strange experiences. But it wasn't only the security guards reporting these events, because it would be quite easy to dismiss their accounts as saying, well, they were up late, they were tired, they were on their own, maybe their minds were playing tricks on them. However, when there's other people corroborating this evidence at other times, that makes it slightly more believable. And a number of people usually work in the evening shifts, so not overnight, but certainly that quieter period from 6 o'clock up until about midnight, say, we're seeing shadowy forms in this building. And I know from experience what it's like to finish work on quite a late shift, to knock off at about 11 o'clock, and then to walk down flights of stairs in the near darkness on your own. And it is quite easy for your mind to play tricks on you and to jump at your own shadow. And that is not to dismiss anyone's experiences at all, because I've spoken to some people who are deadly, deadly serious about what they believe they saw, certainly on the stairs and those areas. And what really adds a twist to this story and makes it quite different and makes it quite eerie, even eerier than it was before, is the use of the lift. And I've mentioned the stairs, but the lift was also involved. And there were occasions when the lift was called to floors in the building. I think there were about 5 floors in total, but called to floors in the building when it was known there was nobody working on the floors above. So the lift, for example, might go from the 2nd floor up to the 4th floor when people knew there was nobody on the 3rd floor, never mind the 4th floor, who could have called that lift upwards. And again, you can put your skeptical hat on here and you could say, well, that could just be a malfunction with a lift. It could just be someone playing a joke. Maybe one of those security people decided to pop up and call the lift with them. However, there is yet another twist to this story, because when the lift was called back down to the correct floor, it is said that as the doors opened so that people could enter and exit the lift, shadowy forms were seen to emerge from it. These shadowy forms were not just lurking in the corridors, they were seemingly using the lift, maybe even calling the lift to travel around floors. So these were not just tricks of the light, they were also seen in the full glare of the lift and emerging out into corridors. Now, getting back to Swansea Castle, that's the end of that tangent, for now at least anyway. Synchronicity might bring it back to us later, but getting back to Swansea Castle. And I mentioned the Blue Lady, who might just be a modern day invention, but is spoken of in connection with this castle. But in my research at least, the most popular sighting at the castle, the most regularly seen figure or figures at the castle, are described as shadowy forms. Yes, shadowy forms, just like we spoke about moments ago in the newspaper office down the road. Synchronicity has kicked in already. See, this isn't just random rubbish. It might be rubbish, but it's not random rubbish. Shadowy forms are by far the most regularly sighted figures at Swansea Castle, and that means very similar apparitions have been sighted on the site of the old newspaper building outside Swansea Castle, and inside the building they relocated to down the road in Adelaide Street. Now, before I can tell you any more, we've reached the point in the episode where I have to give you a health and safety announcement, because I need to stress, and I can't stress this enough, Swansea Castle is a ruin. And as such, it's not somewhere you can just wander inside of. As I said, it's an easy place to visit, it's free to walk up to, but it's also a difficult place to visit because you can't actually cross the boundary, as it were, and go inside. All of the windows are barricaded up with metal bars. All of the doors are locked. So you can get right up close and personal to it. You can touch the castle, but you cannot cross the boundaries. So please, 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 after listening to this, if you are inspired to visit, and I hope you are inspired to visit, don't go trying to climb the walls, don't go abseiling up the side of the castle and falling off and breaking your leg or anything like that. However, that's not to say it is permanently off limits. Of course, the people working there get access to it. And the lovely people at Swansea Council did give me permission to go inside. Now, there were strict rules. It was under strict supervision. I had to wear the correct gear. I had one of those nice, shiny, high-vis jackets on, the hard hat, the works. So if anything fell on me, hopefully I would have been protected. And from the vantage points I was able to access inside, I could get much closer to the areas where these shadowy forms are said to have been seen. Now, again, the good news is you can see most of these places from different angles, but you can see most of these places from ground level outside, because these shadowy forms, for the most part, pretty much flit back and forth by the windows. In fact, they have been described as looking like the shadows of people who are just walking along the floors and happen to walk past the window as they go about their business. However, there's a big problem with that because the floors are no longer there. And without going into too much spooky, complex theories or anything, but we've got an example here of the stone tape kind of idea of ghosts just repeating actions again and again, even though the world around them is changing. So in the case of Swansea Castle, while it might well be a ruin, while entire sections, rooms and floors might no longer be there, these spirits couldn't care less. They are carrying on regardless. And while I said you could observe this quite easily from outside, from the public area, where this would be advantageous is that if you could experience the same thing from the other side, from inside the ruins, in theory, the shadowy form would, I'm assuming, be floating through the sky rather than just passing by a window. Now, as for what it was like to actually explore inside, it was a fantastic experience in person, but it's the kind of thing that doesn't come across so well on a podcast because effectively you're walking around ruins. What I would say is if you ever get the opportunity, jump at it. It's a wonderful place to explore, but there's only so much description I can give because effectively it's a bunch of old stones. And if I had to pick a favourite part, a highlight, it would definitely be the turret or the tower that still survives. There's this tower, complete tower, sticking up into the Swansea sky, and you can climb up to the top of it. And from this vantage point, you can look down on a street, Swansea's most infamous street, and that is Wine Street, which confuses a lot of tourists because it's spelt W-I-N-D, so people might think it's Wind Street, but I can assure you it's definitely Wine Street. And that more boozy sounding name is much more appropriate because there are a ridiculous amount of spirits of a different kind consumed here in large quantities over the weekend and most other days of the week, from what I can gather. And to give my international listeners an idea of the kind of carnage that you can expect to experience on Wine Street. I remember back in my journalist days when I was based in the centre of Swansea, and there was an American television crew who had travelled to Swansea on the Friday night before Christmas, what we traditionally call Black Friday in the UK, as opposed to the American Black Friday, which is in November, I believe, but they both involve spending lots of money, but over here people spend lots of money on alcohol, and too much alcohol at that. But Black Friday in the UK is the Friday before Christmas, and there is so much partying, so much drinking that takes place on Swansea's Wine Street at this time of year that it makes international news. So this is the level of drinking we're talking about, and this is the kind of drinking that you can look down on from the top of Swansea Castle. And this is why at the start of this episode I said it was a very easy but a very difficult place for a paranormal investigation. Because on the one hand, it is fantastically easy. You can, at any time of day or night, just walk up to it and start investigating. But what makes it fantastically difficult is that it is such a party area. There is so much noise and chaos coming out of Wine Street that, frankly, anyone standing outside Swansea Castle trying to capture EVPs on a Saturday night is going to pick up a few voices that they're not going to want to play back in polite company. So really, if you're going to explore, it's best explored in the daytime. And if you time it just right, you might get a quiet spot when it isn't too crazy all around. And that is how you can and you can't investigate this castle, and these are the ghosts that you will or you won't see while you're there. But before I let you go, I did promise you some romantic royalty. And to wrap up this episode with another remarkable piece of synchronicity, I love how this episode is all coming together, but I mentioned that from this turret at the top of Swansea Castle, you can look down at Wine Street, unfurling beneath you. And I have included a photo that I took from the top of the castle in the book, just in case I haven't plugged it enough on this episode. But looking down, and there is a particular building that has changed names several times since then. But in the 1800s, there was a public house down below called the Mackworth Arms. Now, the Mackworth Arms is long gone from Wine Street. It closed, it relocated to High Street, and where it went from there, I don't know. But on October the 11th, 1816, this public house in the shadow of Swansea Castle became the talk of the town when the local newspaper, possibly even the one Dylan and I used to work for, that really would be some more synchronicity, although it didn't exist in its current form then, but certainly a predecessor, but the local newspaper described that a melancholy discovery had been discovered inside the Mackworth Arms. More specifically, they had found the dead body of a young woman. This young woman was found dead in the room she'd been renting, and next to her was an empty bottle of laudanum and a suicide note, which suggests this is an open and shut case. She probably took her own life, and that is certainly the assumption everyone jumped to at the time. But this wasn't a local woman. This wasn't a Swansea woman who seemingly had taken her own life. She had only just arrived in the city, or the town as it was then, from Bristol. And her name was Fanny Imlay Godwin. Fanny Imlay Godwin. And Fanny's mother's name was Mary Wollstonecraft. And her adopted father's name, who married Mary Wollstonecraft, and whose name she took, was William Godwin. Now, these are two hugely important names in the romantic world and beyond of the 1800s, which I won't go into in too much detail here because we haven't really got time for another tangent, and this isn't really the time and the place. But what I will say is that even if you aren't familiar with those two, you might be more familiar with their daughter and Fanny's half-sister, whose name was also Mary, and her married name was Shelley. Mary Shelley, who, while still a teenager, wrote one of the greatest works of fiction of the 19th century, of any century, Frankenstein, or a modern Prometheus. So the half-sister of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, was found dead in a room in the shadow of Swansea Castle, having seemingly taken her own life. And if that wasn't enough, there's one more famous name from this family that we haven't mentioned yet. Mary's husband, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. And this is where history gets a little bit murky and the facts get a little bit obscured. But Percy and his wife Mary clearly knew there was something seriously wrong with Fanny. And it was recorded that Percy was frantically dashing across the country in her pursuit. Now, by country, I'm assuming he was dashing across England to begin with, because she was in Bristol before Swansea, and then from England into Wales in pursuit of his troubled sister-in-law. Now, we don't know if Percy made it to Swansea or not. If he did, he clearly arrived too late, sadly, but as seems to be the case with so many of these romantic lives, with Shelley's life, with Mary's life, there is a mystery to be solved here, and it's a mystery within a mystery within a mystery, because there is a final detail within this tragic scene that has never been explained, and that is, before Fanny's body was discovered, presumably she was found by somebody working there, the name of the addressee on her suicide note, so whoever the suicide note had been addressed to, had been torn off. It had been ripped away, and the burnt paper from the top of that letter was found in the fireplace. Now, this suggests that somebody had entered her room after she had taken her own life, had concealed evidence, and had not alerted anyone to the body. And that begs a further question, because if there was somebody sneaking around the room and tampering with evidence, was it even suicide in the first place? Those are questions we will never, presumably, know the answers to. But that tragic note has brought us to the end of another episode of the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you haven't already, please consider pressing the subscribe button. And if you really enjoyed it, you can support the podcast by rating it, reviewing it, and telling all your friends about it. And if you really, really, really enjoyed it, you can support the podcast going forward by treating me to a coffee via my website, which goes towards maintaining this podcast and is always very much appreciated. If you'd like more Ghosts and Folklore, you can follow me on social media. And as well as this podcast, I've also written a number of books about similar weird and wonderful subjects, which are available from all good bookshops, offline and on. In particular, as I might have mentioned once or twice on this episode, Paranormal Swansea and Gower is my next book, which is being published in August 2024, and it features Swansea Castle and some of the photos I've mentioned on this episode while I was snooping around, and a heck of a lot more from the area. You can pre-order that now from all the usual places. As I always say, please check with your local bookshop first, but failing that, you can get it worldwide from all the usual big bookselling type places. And I am planning some launch events, some signings in and around the Swansea area in August. I'm ashamed to say I haven't sorted this out yet, as regular listeners will know my life is slightly chaotic at the moment, but I will get that arranged before the next episode, before the August episode, in fact. I will tell you all about the launches coming up, and of course, if you follow me on social media, it will be all over social media the second I get the dates and the venues confirmed. And of course, if you'd like to suggest somewhere I could go and do some signings or some talks or anything, or even if you are a venue or a bookshop and you'd like me to pop along, please get in touch again via the website or social media. And on that note, it just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening. Diolch and fawr am wrando. I've been Mark Rees. This has been my Ghosts and Folklore podcast, beaming to you from Wales to the world. And remember, if you do find yourself on Wine Street at Christmas or at any other time of the year, it's not the spirits in the castle you need to worry about. It's the spirits being poured in the bars that are truly terrifying. Until next time, Nosta.